It has indeed been a while,
Yeah.
but we are glad to be back. It's been a while. A lot has been happening, but our heart is still in this mission to reach out to people out there and to be a source of comfort. So yeah, we're glad to be back.
Yes. And today we have a topic that is actually universal. This one is one that has definitely affected every single one. If you haven't been impacted yet, you will one day because it's inevitable.
Yeah.
And we are talking about grief.
Yeah, grieving, just like you said, is universal. We have felt the feelings, the emotions of grief in one way or the other. And when you grieve, there are many situations that causes us to feel those emotions, that causes us to be in that place of grief. So we are going to try to cover some of those events today, but then our major focus is going to be on grief of a loved one today. But before we get started, we're going to, in our introduction, talk about what grief is, define grief, and then we'll go from there.
But I'm thinking if we can just put it in a nutshell and make it really simple, why don't we just say grief is a normal emotional response to the loss of a loved one, but Vivian was talking about the different kinds of grief, and even though we said we are going to focus on when we lose our loved ones, we know there are different kinds of grief. Loss of a pet, losing a baby, stillbirth, or miscarriages, losing one's independence when we age, when we start getting older and we are no longer able to care for ourselves independently and having someone else to care for us. We can definitely grieve, that losing that independence or autonomy. How about can people actually grieve financial security in general? Like maybe someone loses their job, sense of identity.
Yeah.
For some people, their job is their sense of identity. With COVID, a whole lot of people lost their sense of identity.
Exactly.
That career they had been building for years. Identity maybe empty nesting.
Yeah.
When your children are grown,
Yeah.
you're empty nesting.
Indeed. Oh yes.
When your children are grown and out of the house, and just that sense of motherhood, fatherhood, parenting.
So pretty much from what she's shared, grief really, to sum it up, is an emotional response to a loss. A loss of anything in your life. Like she just said just now, empty nesting. You're not necessarily grieving the fact that the person is not there. It's just the relationship, the role that you once played, and now your roles are changing. So you go through this emotional state where you feel like you're losing something. You're trying to re-identify yourself. You want to identify yourself because before that period ended, that stage in your life came to that point in time, there was a significance associated with the role that you played. So now, when the children are grown and out of the house, you feel a sense of loss because now you don't know what role you're playing anymore. So you go through this emotional process that can be identified as grief, and it is very similar to the emotional process you go through when you lose somebody as well. It might not be as intense, but you're trying to re-identify yourself and find a new meaning for your life. So yeah, so grief really, in a nutshell, is the loss of something, yeah.
And those, those responses reactions towards that loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And those responses, right, can be behavioral. What we do. The responses can be emotional, how we feel. They can be cognitive, how we think now that our loved ones or our loved one is no longer there. Let's talk a little bit about sudden death. Unexpected death.
Yeah, unexpected death can be very shocking. The first thing that might go through you is just shock, disbelief, anger, so many emotions. It can become so overwhelming that you're not able to think clearly. But it can bring on sudden emotional turmoil to the body that it might, either depending on how you manage it, you deal with it, or how you express your grief, it might set you in a place of recovery, or it might set you in a place of constant pain. So yeah, sudden death is definitely it creates a confused state of mind for the individual that has to bear that sudden loss. Yeah.
This one is the most painful. All death, is painful, but sudden death can, people describe pain, and they have different forms of pain and say, it aches, it burns, and then some people will say sharp pain. The pain that comes from sudden death can be sharp, severe, unbearable, awful, overwhelming kind of pain that comes from it. And like Vivian said, shock, confusion, disbelief. I can't believe that happened. How on earth did that happen? What? Those are kind of the emotional responses that come from with sudden death. Anticipatory grief, when we are anticipating for a loved one to die. I've had an experience with sudden death, unexpected. You've had an experience with anticipatory, death. Do you want to, kind of share what that feels like when you are anticipating for a loved one to pass on? What it's like?
Yeah, it's a wave of emotions, and everybody deals with this differently. It is a wave of emotion that comes over you, and one of those emotions that comes over you is a feeling of, I wish this is not happening. You really want to pray it away. You want to deny it. You want to wish it wasn't happening. You want to make promises. You want to say, oh man, if this did not happen, this is what I would do. I promise to do better. You fight it, and you just go through those emotions to try to avoid that loss to come upon you from happening. So you do everything you can. But in anticipatory death, in my own case, as much as I didn't want it to happen, I had to eventually face the reality that this might happen. So initially, in the beginning, a feeling of fear overwhelmed me. It was so debilitating that I was doing everything I can to try to avoid it. I just, everything, whatever, I was willing to do anything. But then when it came to a point when I realized that everything I was doing wasn't making any difference, then my head started to go there. What if? And a feeling of fear would just overwhelm me. And then my heart would race, the adrenaline would kick in, and sleeplessness kicked in, and a lot of emotions, mixed emotions, and it's just completely, it's already almost like disorienting. You know what I mean? You're just going about your day, but you don't even know what you're doing anymore. That confusion. You're just like living for the day, for the moment. and then all of a sudden feelings will just overwhelm you. Then you react to it, you manage those feelings, you move on. But when it eventually happened, in your mind it was coming, right? And then eventually happened. Then you just come to terms with it. Well, in my own case, I think anticipating something like that happening, it helped me get through the different emotions associated with the event. Yes.
And that's why it's called, anticipatory grief, because you go through all the stages of grief, that happens when you eventually lose a loved one. But in this case, you are going through those stages even before your loved one passes on. I heard you say at a point you would feel like, whatever I could do to prevent this from happening, which is bargaining.
Difference, exactly.
Like, God, if you would keep my loved one from dying, I will do this or I will do that, Or even some of us might even make promises to medical professionals or, anyone that could save our loved one. If you could save my loved one, I'm gonna do this. Or even tell our loved one, if you can hang on, fight this and live, I'm gonna change. That thing you've been wanting me to change for years now or do, I'm going to. So we go through, that bargaining, but like you said, in that process, at a point, you kind of begin to accept the fact that, you've done what you can, or everything you could possibly do, and your loved one is inevitably going to pass on. But does it mean, when you accept, and this is also applicable to, just a normal, again, that normal death or grief, when we get to a point of acceptance, like, okay, this is reality, this is gonna happen. Does it hurt less? Does it mean it doesn't hurt? Does it mean the pain is no longer there? Does it mean it's okay for our loved one to...
No, in my case, it doesn't mean the pain is still not there, It hits you. But in my case, it didn't hit me as like... I think the shock was not as heavy as if I wasn't expecting it. So I was able to grieve, let out my emotion, and immediately transition to, okay, what do we do now? Unlike if I wasn't expecting it, if it was sudden, I think because I have experienced that aspect as well. If it is sudden, you are in a confused state of mind longer, because you're trying to grasp an understanding as to how this could have happened. So you're just going with the emotions every day. But in anticipatory grief, I think in my own case, it allowed me to process the process of grief without me even knowing it. And then allowed me to come to terms with the inevitable. And even though I didn't want that to happen, but it allowed me to come to terms with it. So it allowed me to deal with the inevitable when eventually was evitable. You know what I mean? So when it eventually happened, it allowed me to deal with it. It allowed me to move on, and it allowed me to be there to comfort my mother, my family members that were not emotionally there. And it allowed me to comfort the loved ones that were closest, I really believe it did, because I found myself, even though I was grieving this loss, I found myself being the one now comforting everybody else. Because in the back of my mind, I couldn't tell them that, well, we all knew this was going to happen. I couldn't say that. But because in my head, I had already prepared my mind that this might happen. It just allowed me to now assume a different role. And be there. And when I assumed that role and I started comforting everybody else, that also actually brought comfort to me as well. That's how I dealt with
You
it.
know, one thing I heard you say when you were talking about acceptance, it's almost like when we are going through anticipatory grief, right? You go through all that process before your loved one dies. You already accept the reality of what's going to happen. Um, but in the case of a sudden death, you weren't expecting anything.
Exactly.
Like you said, the shock is overwhelming. The disbelief. So it kind of takes a time to even come with terms of what did you say? Did it really happen? Oh, it happened. And then now trying to go through the other grief process. So I'm wondering if although you accepted the fact that your loved one might eventually pass, that after they had passed, did you still find yourself going through, over again
the process? Yes,
that
I did.
process?
Yes, I did. So in that state of mind where I felt like I had accepted, the situation, the event, that it was ultimately going to get to this point. I accepted it, and I was consoling everybody else, comforting everybody else. Every now and then, I felt like I went back to the beginning. Is there something I could have done? Could have, maybe, what did I miss? What I just kept going back, So yeah, so that emotion just kept going back and forth. So I was never in one state of mind and never went back to the other part of the grieving process. I was just back and forth. But I never stayed in one state for so long that it held me hostage, for lack of a better term. Held me hostage. And what I mean by that is sometimes grief can be so debilitating that you cannot move. You'll be stuck in one place. And for instance, in the case of sudden death, you'll be so stuck as to why that you're not able to move through the grieving process, the emotional process, and recover from it in a healthy pattern. So in my case, I just kept going back and forth, and I think it's because, like I said before, I did everything I could in the process, and then once I realized that everything that was being done was not making any difference, then my head started thinking about what if. Okay, if this happened, I started preparing my mind. So that preparation allowed me to be able to assume a different role after it actually happened. But still, I went back and forth. Could I have done more? And then every now and then emotions would just overwhelm me, and I would just cry. The fact that I would never see this person again, the fact that I would never hear the voice. I went back and read messages, letters, read cards, looked at pictures, remembered memories. But even though I did all that, I feel like that actually helped me get through it too.
And we're going to talk about that, because sometimes when we lose a loved one, there's something we call avoidance. People will avoid the emotions, the overwhelming emotion that come with grief. Avoid it by maybe they put away pictures of a loved one. They avoid looking at the text messages. I remember in my case, once when one of my sisters passed, a friend that, and she was only trying to be helpful, but one of the advice she gave me was, all those letters your sister wrote you that you have, you need to burn them because she's dead, and you don't want to, there's no relationship between the death and the living. And she was being helpful as a friend, right? But she was killing me with those words at the same time, because those were not helpful at all. But some people would think, if I put away anything that reminds me of the loved one, if I avoid the situations and stuff like that, and this happens mostly with unexpected death, that are traumatic. And bear in mind that we have something we call post-traumatic stress, that usually occur with the sudden death of a loved one, these emotions are overwhelming. And one of them, one of the things sometimes that we do is that avoidance. Avoid every thought, every person, every place, everything that reminds me about that loved one or that loss. But we might also want to watch it, because that can be a sign that we are going from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic stress disorder now, which now is a mental illness. But in the healing process, one thing I heard you say was, with acceptance, people call it healing process, the grieving process. I call it the healing process, because sometimes people will ask, well, what does healing look like? What is healing? But the fact is, we actually start healing as we grieve. We heal as we grieve. And so, when we come to that acceptance stage, and you said, I would go and I look at pictures, and, I would read messages, and I wonder, if you ever found any form of comfort with looking at those pictures, reading messages, or did they trigger only depressive feelings?
Yeah, when I went with the anticipatory grief, they brought some kind of comfort, and it made me hold on to those memories even more dearly. But with the sudden grief that I also experienced, it took me a long time before I could look at pictures or even be in an environment that looked similar to the environments I once was with my loved one, because they just triggered that sense of loss, that, oh my God, I once did this, but this is not here no more. So it took me a whole lot longer to recover from that loss than the other loss. And I will not say that you fully recover, because whenever you think about the individual or about the loss, since we're focusing on the loss of a loved one, whenever you think about the loss of that loved one, there's a certain amount of feeling that comes over you, but it's not as overwhelming as it causes you not to be able to function. Exactly. Yeah. So that is when I realized that I was I had healed, or I was becoming okay, because it took a long time before I could talk about my sister, listen to her messages, read her letters, look at her picture, and not have this feeling of deep loss that I was in mourning all over again. What I did instead was, those memories, I remember the happiness that were associated with those memories, as opposed to just focusing on the loss associated with the memories. Because when you take pictures, when you're in an event, whatever, it is happy times that causes you to make those memories. But in the beginning of a loss, you're not thinking about the happy times.
You don't.
You're only thinking about the fact that I will not have this again.
Exactly.
But as time went on, and I started remembering the things that led us to make those memories, and it will bring smiles to my face. And then I started to appreciate the time that I had. Yeah.
You use the word smile. So they actually, sometimes when we are grieving or mourning, or especially in sudden death, right? Smile is not one of the words that come to mind,
at all.
or it's not a reality to someone, But when you say smile later, that means that we can go through a healing process and come to the point where those memories that we avoided, that caused us overwhelming emotions at the beginning of the grief, can also be the memories that can that we can think about, look at, and smile.
Yeah.
Because then we associate them with, the happy moments that we shared with our loved ones.
Yeah.
I did experience that. I experienced that too. And I think this is going to be, something applicable to everyone that has experienced a sudden loss. In fact, there was a particular song, I avoided it. I didn't want to hear it, and I didn't want to sing it. I knew I had come to a place of healing when I could sing that song again and not sob. Because at the beginning it reminded me of my sister. She taught me to sing that song. So at the beginning of after her loss, it was a no-no to me, and so when I could sing it and not sob or become overwhelmingly depressed or even angry, I could tell that's healing.
Yeah.
And we talk about healing after loss, how different it might look for everyone. So we talk about sudden and anticipatory, but there's something, a preparatory form of grief where this is actually the individual who is eventually going to pass on. You have received a diagnosis, and at a terminal stage of an illness, and it's everyone, the family knows that I am going to eventually pass on. This is usually a stage of life where you hear people talk about, forgiveness. They kind of resolve their conflicts, they talk over their conflicts. People would be holding grudges or anger, frustration, even resentment towards a family member. Preparatory grief, it's a stage where these family members have that opportunity to actually get to express those frustrations and anger and hurt and pain. Afford one another the opportunity to forgive, to apologize, accept wrong, done to family members, feel remorse, go through a sense of remorse and repentance, apologize to family members, reconcile, forgive family members, reconcile. And there's a sense of peace that comes with that, when every family member is at a state, is good and okay with one another, that reconciliation. And then saying goodbye to the loved one. Sometimes we avoid, I've heard people say, well, I don't want to go see them because I only want to remember what they looked like when they were healthy. I don't think I can bear seeing them, how they look now, or even coming to grasp with the idea that they are going to die. But also, I've also heard people regret that, eventually when the loved one is passed and they go, I wish I had gone to see them. I wish I had told them this. I wish I had told them that. I wish I had said goodbye. I didn't even get to say goodbye. Some people will say, go visit, go see them, go reconcile your differences. Go and express your forgiveness or seek for their forgiveness and go say goodbye.
With this preparatory grief, like I said, mentioned earlier, it goes both ways, because the individual that it has now been informed that this is a terminal illness and this is when you should expect this to end. It is overwhelming grief.
I bet.
And because I've never experienced it before, but I do know people who have gone through this. And if I remember very correctly, vividly, this individual, what helped them get through the process until this individual passed away was, being supportive to the individual, and then the person eventually came to terms with what's going on, and then the person took control over preparing for the day, for this getting to this point. So when the person eventually was supported to take control, to make preparation towards the end of life, it helped them stay in that state of mind. They felt like they were functional in that state of mind, preparing for their end stage of life, and then help the family deal with the process of knowing this is how it's going to end. And then when eventually ended, I believe it also helped the family come to terms with what had just happened. So I would think that initially, even though everybody is grieving what is coming, what is anticipated, the type of support the individual gets is going to determine, hopefully, maybe to determine how everybody manages their grief. You know what I mean?
Yes. And this support you are talking about could come, you know, in the form of understanding, you know, being understanding, you know, when your loved one, because the one loved one that's going to eventually pass is going to go through these stages of grief, right? Which means they might go through a time that they are very angry. They are angry, irritable, frustrated. And they might take that anger out on you. So patience, you know, there's going to be a lot of patience needed on your part. You know, if you are the family member, that's where that support comes in. Or when, you know, they can go through their depressive moods and stuff like that, and this is not a time to tell them to snap out of it. You know, it's a time to help them kind of go, because they need to go through all of that before coming in turn, you know, with, okay, this is going to happen. You know, how do we transition into this how do I transition into this reality now? Right? So how about let's talk about the different, you know, ways that we respond to the loss of our loved ones. You know, what happens, what goes on here when we lose our loved ones?
Wow, it's a lot. Because it is very obvious there's a physical change. So you're on an emotional roller coaster, and then it now presents itself in physical. You know, the way you carry yourself, the way you think, the way you present, the way you relate with people. You know, so it is, you know, it changes a lot. Yeah, it changes a lot in the individual.
I've heard people, you know, people will talk about, I experienced some of these, you know, with my different losses. So headaches, muscle ache, like your whole body is aching. You just feel like you've been run over by a truck, you know. Some people will experience just trouble sleeping. Some people sleep, some people might sleep too much, some people might not sleep at all. You know, in my case, I couldn't sleep, you know, and then I've had so many people that will talk about, you know, them not being able to sleep for a while. And you know what, that happens sometimes, you know, when we are deprived of sleep, it can just touch on every other aspect of our functioning. That's why you can see weight fluctuations with grief. Some people might gain weight, some people might lose weight. Emotionally, you know, you are talking about emotional roller coaster, you know, depression. So with grief, when we talk about depression with grief, you know, some people might start thinking, oh, I have depression. Remember, there's a difference between a mental disorder and a normal emotional response to external, you know, stressors when something happens that is causing, you know, these emotions. The depression we feel with grief is not clinical. You know, something we call situational depression. And sometimes it can look mild, you know, sometimes it can be moderate, sometimes it can be severe, you know, which is why sometimes people would become suicidal after they lose a loved one, especially with sudden death. And so you talk about those emotional roller coaster, there's anxiety, there's fear, you know, there's overwhelming sense of sadness, crying, sobbing, and how about cognitive, you know, the way we think, you know, confusion, you know, some people might not concentrate, you know,
Yeah, you just pretty much just completely, what is that word that I use oftentimes when I feel out of sorts? You feel discombobulated.
Oh, that's a big word.
I mean, it really is
Yes.
so disorienting, you know? You know how, you get up in the morning, you have your routines, right? You get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you take a shower, you do this, you do that, you do that. But then when when you're in that state of deep emotional grief because of a loss of an individual, you don't even know whether you're coming or going anymore, you know? So you're in that space where, things you just come you completely do everything out of routine, so you just feel disoriented. And just like you said earlier, grief really actually is a process of healing
Yes.
from a loss. So when you go through those emotions, the emotions of grief, you're going through the process of healing from a loss.
Yes. Yes.
And eventually the disorientation will start to dissipate. You start to find yourself, your footing on the ground again. Yeah. So yeah.